Okay, so yesterday in American politics, right? It was nuts. You probably want to know what really happened, and that's exactly why we're here. We're doing a deep dive into executive orders and inflation headaches and the budget showdown. Oh, and don't forget the potential earthquake in U.S. foreign policy.
We're talking about a day that could really reshape the political landscape, maybe for years to come. And we've got all these news articles and social media posts and expert takes to help us make sense of it.
Like, seriously, Elon Musk was in the Oval Office with a Maggie hat. And no, I'm not kidding, folks. That's just the tip of the iceberg here.
Yeah, let's start with that picture. I mean, it really does set the tone for the whole day. President Trump signed an executive order that gives Elon Musk, like, an unbelievable amount of control over the government.
Hold on. What does this executive order actually do?
Basically, it sets up this new thing called the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE for short, and puts Elon Musk in charge. This department now has the power to hire and fire people and even downsize across all government agencies.
So Musk is kind of calling the shots now. What does that mean, putting so much power in one person's hands, especially someone who wasn't elected?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Oh.
Josh Marshall from Talking Points memo called Musk an independent actor with almost unlimited authority. It's like having a shadow government on top of the one we already have. And historically, that kind of concentrated power can be a recipe for disaster.
Didn't Musk say he would find, billions in government waste? Did anything ever come of that?
Well, that's where things get a little fuzzy. Representative Moskowitz from Florida and some others in Congress are asking for some transparency. They're saying they haven't seen any evidence of all this waste Musk was talking about. And the White House press secretary, she just gives these vague answers about agencies going against the president's policies.
It's not exactly confidence-inspiring, is it? And then you've got those reports in the New York Times and the Washington Post about agencies that were looking into Musk's businesses getting shut down. Makes you wonder,
Definitely raises some red flags. Think about it. Someone gets the power to get rid of the agencies that are investigating them. That's a massive conflict of interest. It's like the fox guarding the henhouse.
It's a little creepy, honestly. I mean, how comfortable are you with this much private influence over the government? Something to consider, right?
Yeah, no doubt. We're in uncharted territory here, and the implications could be huge. Definitely something to watch closely.
Absolutely. And speaking of things that hit close to home, let's talk about inflation. Not great news there either.
No, not at all. The consumer price index shot up again last month, and everyone's feeling it. Gas prices, rent, groceries. It's tough out there.
Tell me about it. Those egg prices, though, up 15% just last month. Ouch. I'm feeling it in my wallet every time I go to the store.
It's hurting a lot of people, no doubt about it. And to make things potentially worse, you have President Trump slapping a 25% tariff on all that imported steel and aluminum.
What does that even mean for me, the average person? How are these tariffs going to affect my life?
Well, think about everything that's made with steel and aluminum. Cars, appliances, building materials. Prices for all that stuff are probably going to climb even higher. More fuel for the inflation fire.
Of course, the blame game is in full swing. Trump's out there pointing fingers at Biden inflation, no surprise there. But here's the interesting part. Even some Republicans are pushing back against his policies.
That's right. You've got Senator McConnell, one of the top Republicans, straight up criticizing those tariffs in his op-ed. He's saying they're hurting Americans, especially in his home state of Kentucky. McConnell claims Kentucky families are paying like $1,200 more every year thanks to these tariffs. And get this, he's actually calling for international cooperation to deal with inflation. That's a pretty big change from Trump's America First thing.
It just goes to show, even within a single party, there can be huge disagreements about how to handle the economy. And hey, speaking of economic challenges, there's another battle brewing in Washington. That government shutdown deadline is coming up fast, March 14th.
Right, and it seems like Republicans are leaning toward passing a continuing resolution to keep things running for now, instead of working on specific spending bills.
Which seems kind of ironic, right? Aren't they usually the ones complaining about all the government waste?
Yeah. How do you see that as ironic?
Well, I mean, Representative Moskowitz made a good point. If they really believe the government is so bloated and wasteful, wouldn't they want to look at every single spending bill in detail instead of just rubber stamping a continuing resolution?
That's a fair point. It does make you wonder how committed they really are to cutting spending. Or maybe it's all just political gamesmanship.
Exactly. So let's dive into this Republican budget proposal. We're talking about some serious cuts here, right?
Oh yeah, big time. They're suggesting a $2 trillion cut from mandatory spending. That includes programs like Social Security and Medicare.
And it gets worse. They're even talking about cutting food assistance for over 40 million Americans, folks who are already having a tough time putting food on the table.
The House Agriculture Committee is apparently looking at something like $150 billion in cuts from programs that help people get food. That could have a devastating impact on low-income families.
It's hard to stomach, especially when you think about how they're also proposing $4.5 trillion in tax cuts for the wealthy and corporations.
And then on top of that, they want to raise the debt ceiling by another $4 trillion.
Wow, that's a lot to wrap your head around. These budget cuts could really hurt a lot of people, especially those who depend on these programs.
Absolutely. This isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet, you know. This is about real people's lives. We're talking about potentially taking away lifelines for millions of Americans while giving huge tax breaks to those who are already doing just fine.
Definitely food for thought. So what do you think about all these trade-offs being proposed? How do you see all of this playing out?
That's what we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive. We'll unpack all the potential consequences of these budget battles and how they could affect everyone.
It's crazy to think how decisions made in Washington can affect what we pay for groceries and whether we can even get health care. But switching gears a bit, yesterday wasn't just about domestic issues. There were some pretty major things happening internationally, too.
Definitely. And honestly, some of it's kind of scary.
Yeah.
It feels like a turning point in U.S. foreign policy.
What happened? What has people so worried?
Well, for a long time, decades really, U.S. foreign policy has been all about working together with other countries. International cooperation, collective security, that kind of thing. We've been big supporters of organizations like NATO. The whole idea is to stop powerful countries from picking on weaker ones and just generally keep things stable around the world.
And now it seems like that's changing.
It looks that way. To really get it, we got to look back a little. Remember in 2016 when Trump's campaign kind of softened their stance on what Russia was doing in Ukraine? And then during his first term, he was often siding with Putin and even talked about pulling the U.S. out of NATO. There's a pretty big shift from how both parties usually handled foreign policy.
Yeah, that caused a lot of controversy. And it's pretty different from how the Biden administration acted. They were all about strengthening NATO and supporting Ukraine, especially after the Russian invasion.
Exactly. But now, with Trump back in the White House, things are getting, a bit worrisome. He's been making comments about, taking over other countries. Panama, Canada, even Greenland.
That sounds pretty dictator-ish, to be honest.
It is. It's dangerous talk. And it completely goes against that whole system of international cooperation that the U.S. built up after World War II. We could be looking at the end of NATO, NORAD, even the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance.
The consequences could be huge. What happened yesterday that's really fueling this anxiety?
Well, there was that meeting of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group. It was set up during the Biden administration to coordinate aid to Ukraine. But at the meeting yesterday, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth basically said what Putin wants. He said restoring Ukraine's borders to what they were before 2014 is unrealistic. And he said the U.S. won't support Ukraine joining NATO.
So basically, he's giving Putin everything he wants without getting anything back.
Pretty much. And then, to make it worse, he puts the responsibility for helping Ukraine on Europe. He says the U.S. needs to focus on its own borders. It's like he's abandoning Ukraine and betraying our allies.
And what about that phone call between Trump and Putin, the one they called highly productive?
Oh, yeah, that one. The one where they agreed to work together and visit each other's countries. The crazy part is President Zelensky wasn't even included in the conversation. The guy who actually runs Ukraine.
That's disturbing. It's like they're deciding what to do with Ukraine without caring about the people who live there.
It's a bad precedent. Reading between the lines, it seems like Putin wants the sanctions lifted, but it's not clear what he's offering in return. The whole thing is super secretive.
It's the opposite of what France, Germany, Poland, Italy, Spain, and the UK said in their joint statement, right? They said they're still committed to Ukraine's sovereignty and that Ukraine and Europe need to be part of any negotiations.
Yeah, that statement was a strong message. Those countries are standing together and showing they won't just let Ukraine be abandoned.
So it's like the U.S. is getting closer to Putin and undermining Ukraine, while our European allies are standing strong in their support. That's a pretty big difference.
It is. And it makes you think, what's going to happen to the transatlantic alliance? It feels like global power dynamics are shifting, and the U.S. is doing something totally different from its usual allies.
There's a lot to think about. It's not just international stuff that happened yesterday, though, right? There were some big developments back in the U.S., too.
Oh, yeah, for sure. One that I thought was interesting was that prisoner swap with Mark Fogel, the American teacher who was stuck in Russia.
The one where they traded him for that Russian cybercriminal.
Exactly, Alexander Vinnik, some kind of cybercrime mastermind.
Yeah.
Trump acted like Russia didn't get much in return, but that's hard to believe since they wouldn't even consider Fogel for a prisoner swap before.
You have to wonder what really happened behind the scenes to get Fogel back.
I know, right? This administration doesn't exactly like transparency, especially when it comes to Russia.
And then there's the whole thing with the Senate confirming Tulsi Gabbard as the new director of national intelligence.
That was, to put it mildly, controversial. Gabbard has said some pretty pro-Russia and pro-Assad things in the past, so people were worried about her being in such an important position.
All the Democrats voted against confirming her, but there is one interesting exception.
Senator McConnell. Yeah, he's the top Republican, but he broke from his party and said he had serious doubts about Gabbard's qualifications and if she could be trusted. He even said she failed to demonstrate that she's ready for a job like that.
Wow. That's a big statement from someone in his position. Sounds like people are really worried about this appointment.
Yeah, for good reason. Putting someone in charge of all U.S. intelligence who might be loyal to someone else is a pretty risky move.
It's all a little unsettling. Just yesterday, we saw global alliances possibly shifting, controversial prisoner swaps, and a questionable appointment to a key intelligence role. It's a lot to take in.
Yeah, no kidding. It's important to think about the long-term effects of all this. What we saw yesterday was a move away from the norms and principles that have guided U.S. policy for decades.
So where does this leave us? What happens next?
That's the big question, isn't it? We're at a crossroads, and the decisions made in the next few days and weeks will shape the future of the U.S. and its role in the world.
It feels like we're standing on, I don't know, shaky ground, both here in the U.S. and, everywhere else. Yesterday was a lot.
It was a wild ride, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But maybe it's a wake-up call. A chance to rethink some of those ideas we take for granted.
Like what?
Well, we've always thought of the U.S. as this force for good in the world, right? Protecting democracy, fighting for freedom, all that. But after yesterday, can we really say that's still true?
That's a hard question. It does feel like we're moving away from those values.
I think so. The things we talked about today, they show a different America, an America that's turning inward, maybe even becoming more isolationist, maybe even a little authoritarian. That's a scary thought.
So of all the things we've covered today, what do you think was the most important? What really stood out to you?
Honestly, it's the change in foreign policy that worries me the most. It's like we're ditching our allies and adopting the worldview of someone like Putin, who, let's be real, doesn't care about democracy or international rules.
That's chilling. What does all of this mean for the future, do you think?
I'm worried about what it means for global stability, honestly. This could mean more authoritarianism, more wars, and a weakening of the organizations that have kept the peace for so long.
It's a lot to be worried about, but earlier you said we're not helpless, right?
No, definitely not.
Yeah.
We have voices, and we need to use them. Stay informed, stay involved, and hold our leaders accountable.
Okay, so what can regular people actually do? These are big challenges.
First, learn as much as you can. Understand the issues, look at different viewpoints, and don't fall for misinformation or propaganda.
Knowledge is power, right.
Mm-hmm.
But what can we do with that power? Talk to people. Have those conversations, even if they're hard. Talk to your family and friends, your colleagues, everyone. Share your concerns, listen to what they have to say, and see if you can find some common ground.
It's about connecting with people, understanding each other, even when we disagree.
Exactly. And don't forget about collective action. There are organizations out there fighting for democracy, human rights, and global cooperation. Support them. And let your elected officials know what you think. Call them, write to them, make your voice heard.
So it's about doing something both on our own and together to create the future we want.
That's it. Remember, the future isn't set in stone. We all have a part to play in shaping it.
This deep dive has been intense, but really eye-opening. Thanks for walking us through it all and helping us understand what's going on.
Happy to do it. And to everyone listening, I'll leave you with this. I've always thought of the U.S. as a force for good in the world, right? Defending democracy and keeping things stable. But is that still true after what we saw yesterday? Was this just a blip? Or are we becoming something different? Think about it, talk about it, but most importantly, do something. The future depends on us all being informed, engaged, and active in creating the world we want to live in.